Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mitchell Clarke. I'm joined by Tom Hall. Today we'll be talking about ransomware attackers that we've seen in Europe and globally in 2020. It's been a big year for ransomware. I feel like every other day we have a news story about a company being affected in the media, devastating consequences, large ransoms and large payouts. So today we'll be talking about two groups, Revil and Doppelpaymer. We'll be talking about their changing tradecraft, the evolution of their operations and development of ransomware as a service and some predictions into what happens into 2021 and going forward. I'm with Mandiant based in the UK. I've been with Mandiant for 2.5 years now, coming across from Australia and Australian government. And I'll hand you across to Tom.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Hall. Like Mitch, I'm a principal consultant based here in the UK in the incident response team. I've been in Mandiant now for 5 years and I head up our European incident response function. I'm going to start today by giving you guys an overview of what we're seeing from trends from some of our operations over the years. As you can see here from the top left, we have self-propagating malware. So this is like WannaCry, NotPetya. Somebody executes it in an environment and it's worm-like its behavior. There's no control over it. The actors don't know where it's going to move to, which networks, which domains are joined to the environment they're executing their malware in. This can be very difficult and have large blowouts like we've seen in the news. We've then seen a move towards more manual detonation because of this. This broadly falls into two camps. You have pretty wide-ranging, untargeted campaigns, so kind of spray and pray if you'd like, typically using things like exploit kits, hoping to get lucky by putting out as many places as possible on the chances that one victim organisation will get compromised. Where we're going to focus on really is on the targeted deployments. So these are operators who are following kind of an APT-style life cycle. So they may have a number of organisations they're targeting, but their campaigns will be very specific to each organisation, usually things like phishing campaigns. There are two spheres really this falls in. You have kind of self-managed operators. So they'll go through that initial phase of compromise themselves. They'll get persistent within the environment. They'll move around. They'll execute the ransom, and then they'll put the demands through to the victim organisation themselves. What we're going to focus on is on the partnership models. So these are operators who will target a number of organisations and then sell on access to ransomware developers. We're going to talk you through kind of two different styles that we see. So we have kind of ransomware as a service, where there's a platform that the operator has and they sell access through that. And a ransomware developer doesn't have to do too much hard work by themselves. And then the second one will be kind of selling of access only. So the ransomware developer gets access to an environment, but after that, it's completely up to them how they deal with it. So as I said, we're going to be looking at APT-style-like intrusions. Now, what's important, I guess, to cover is, what does that look like for an organisation? Well, more than likely, they're going to have domain admin access to your environment. This means they can move around freely, execute their tooling. In order to remove that access, we have to take pretty broad-ranging changes, such as an enterprise-wide password reset to remove that access. They'll probably have backdoors across the environment in multiple forms, so we'll have to run an investigation in order to find all that access to remove it. And they've probably taken some form of data with them. Usually in these campaigns, there always is the threat that we have data as well as encryption. Now, there are regulatory and reputational repercussions because of this. As a business, we need to understand what data is left, has it even left at all, in order to be able to cover these off. Now, we add on the ransomware angle. Well, we have exactly the same issues with a traditional APT-style intrusion, except all of your IT infrastructure is probably not functional. You may want to recover systems, but basic things like the environments that you build systems from may not be working. You may not be able to even pull out patches on an automated basis like you would normally do. This can make it really difficult to perform recovery in an environment that's been hit in this manner. And then we have the business side of it. We've seen in 2020 lots of organisations across Europe who, after being ransomed on day one, haven't been able to function as a business. This can be a real problem for the board because, particularly if you're reliant on specific income at set times, maybe you're servicing clients, this can be very difficult for a business to operate under. And now, what makes this even more difficult is we have to deal with these two issues at the same time. We can't just solve the problem by recovering all of our systems. Yes, okay, we may get initial functioning of the business, but we still have the looming threat that somebody's within your environment and they have full access to it. So we have to both work an investigation and start to recover the business in tandem. It's not until we get two of these pieces working together we can really remove the problem of a ransomware threat. So that's the overview. Mitch now is going to talk you through one of the groups that we see operating, Reboot, and go through that in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Tom. So let's get into Reboot. Reboot are interesting because they run a ransomware as a service platform, a platform with many different affiliates or other attackers that join in to use the same malware and use the same platform. So Reboot first appeared in early 2019 and it was created by an attacker called Unknown. Unknown began recruiting for other affiliates, other attackers to come and join the platform. The benefit for the affiliate is they get access to the automation functionality of the platform, but the downside is they have to pay for that. So they're only able to keep a little bit of their payouts that they extort from their victims. So why would an affiliate do this? Why would an affiliate join into a ransomware as a service platform? The answer is the platform provides a whole bunch of efficiencies and gains that in traditional ransomware operations would be very time intensive, a lot of effort for these groups. So the platform provides the affiliate with the ability to generate malware, Sodinokibi malware in the case of Reboot. It lets the affiliate set their ransom demands and conduct negotiations with the victim organization. It lets them extort and prove to the victim that they've stolen data and ransomware them. So there's a threat from the Reboot groups that the attackers will release stolen data to the general public. And lastly, there's a coin laundering service. So any Bitcoin or Monero paid into the platform can be obfuscated and transferred to different wallets as part of a laundering process to reduce the risk to the affiliate that someone can trace their coins when they cash out. So the Reboot crew use a piece of malware called Sodinokibi. We won't cover the ins and outs of it here. It deserves its own talk, but essentially it's very good malware. It leaves networks largely functional, and that's a key differentiator between different ransomware groups and Reboot. A Reboot deployment will typically leave a network running. Systems will still be online because the ransomware doesn't target system files, system extensions. So this makes it easier for victims to recover from a ransomware event if they pay and if they're able to get that decryption tool. Being an affiliate model, time to ransomware deployment varies between the different individual affiliates. Some choose to only encrypt or deploy ransomware to small parts of victim organizations, but other affiliates choose to take their time and gain access to the entirety of a corporate network. We're talking different domains, different network segments, global lateral movement into the rest of the organization, and mass deployment of the Sodinokibi ransomware across the entire fleet. So devastating ransomware deployment. Of concern or interestingly, some of the affiliates seem to have a backlog of victims. Mandiant is an incident response company with a global presence, so we deal with lots of victims around the globe, and sometimes we see an affiliate working through their victim backlog. We'll see them prioritize and triage, potentially based on revenue, how much they think they'll get out of their victim, publicity, and a whole bunch of other factors, presumably, to choose who they're going to ransom first. So that's a bit about the platform. It's remarkable in terms of development and how ransomware crews are evolving. Now let's talk about how a Reboot breach will occur, what steps the attackers will take, and what tradecraft we see. And again, we're talking about an affiliate model here. So each affiliate will conduct their breach differently. So we've brought all of the tradecraft that we've seen from the different affiliates all into one talk, one section. So what's also interesting about Reboot is that they're conducting mass exploitation against a whole bunch of organizations at once. So they're gaining access to many different organizations using high-profile vulnerabilities that came out, late 2019, early 2020. These vulnerabilities got a lot of attention in the InfoSec community because of their severity. They essentially allow unauthenticated remote access to that edge device. So when we're saying edge devices, we're talking VPNs, SharePoint servers, remote desktop servers, remote access applications like Citrix. So all of those types of edge devices had really high profile and high critical vulnerabilities. REvil exploited them, weeks and months after those vulnerabilities came out. So it's not like we're talking about a vulnerability coming out on Monday and REvil mass exploiting and gaining access to a whole bunch of organizations using that vulnerability on the Tuesday. We're talking weeks and months after these vulnerabilities come out. REvil's also gaining access to organizations through third parties, and this is another evolution in the ransomware playbook. It comes straight from the APT playbook. In 2017, we saw Operation Cloudhopper come out from PwC and BAE, which exposed a whole bunch of APT-10, a Chinese group, a whole bunch of activity from those folk, where they were compromising victims through managed service providers. So we saw that trust and that third-party relationship being leveraged there to gain access. And here we see REvil doing it in 2020. REvil getting extra victims by leveraging that trust, that domain interconnectivity, that network interconnectivity, and moving laterally into those other organizations. We also see traditional methods of compromise, credential stuffing, password spraying, as well as phishing against organizations. So after getting initial access, most of the REvil affiliates will spend a little bit of time establishing foothold. So this could be installing malware on a few extra systems. It could be continuing to abuse the VPN or the remote desktop exposed system or the Citrix farm on the edge, as well as deploying web shells. So again, straight out of the APT playbook, you don't want to have a single access method into an organization. You want several. So the attackers are shoring up their access to victim orgs. This is where we'll usually see a pause for some of these affiliates that have a lot of victims and are mass exploiting a whole bunch of organizations. And this is essentially to leave them on the shelf and come back to them later when they're ready. So when they do come back, we see, again, the typical APT-style escalation of privileges. So the attackers need domain admin or a service account with admin privileges to be able to continue their operations and move laterally within the environment. So we're seeing standard APT tools, we're seeing standard penetration testing tools being used by these groups, such as Mimikatz, Process Dump, and we're also seeing the attackers leverage passwords stored in places they shouldn't be, like group policy preferences, or maybe in scripts on on domain shares, or simply passwords being stored by users where they shouldn't be, in text files on their desktop or spreadsheets or whatnot. So once the REvil attacker is privileged, they're now just as privileged as any admin within the environment. We're seeing them step into the reconnaissance phase, where they'll use open source or commercial or freemium network scanners to map out the victim estate, to understand how big the environment is, what are the trust relationships, how will the attacker move globally to gain access to the rest of the network. To enumerate the Windows Active Directory environment, they're using Bloodhound. Everyone's using Bloodhound. It's such a great tool to map out those domain trusts, pull all computer information and user information, and it's a really great tool to understand the structure of a domain. After reconning the network, it's time for the attacker to establish more presence within the environment, and to do this, they have to move laterally. So after discovering the environment, it's now time to go move across to that environment. And the tools we see being used to conduct this are the same tools that we see, North Korean attackers use, Chinese attackers use, Russian attackers use. We're talking WMI exec and SMB exec from Impacket. We're seeing crackmap exec, which is essentially a remote process execution tool, PS exec from Microsoft, as well as remote desktop to move laterally and log into additional systems in the environment. So we're not seeing crazy tradecraft, but it's effective and it works. So after scanning the environment, it's now time for the attacker to set up shop in these extra networks they've gained access to. So to maintain presence, again, it depends by affiliate. Some affiliates are using cloud remote desktop software. This is remote desktop software that lets you log into a system across the internet. So things like TeamViewer, AnyDesk, LogMeIn, those sorts of software tools. We're also seeing use of Cobalt Strike beacons. Some malware some attackers, some REvil affiliates prefer to use Cobalt Strike, while others prefer to use web shells or to continue abusing those legitimate services that they've gained access to, like VPN, like on-premise virtual remote desktop appliances. So this is where we usually see the second pause. So the first pause was after gaining initial access and establishing a foothold. And this is the second pause before final ransomware deployment and potential data theft. So when REvil is stealing data, sometimes using traditional methods of compressing targeted data and exfilling it out of the corporate network with their malware. But interestingly, we're seeing them use cloud data synchronization platform tools. So things like Mega.nz and pCloud, which are cloud storage solutions, along the same lines as Google Drive or Dropbox or Microsoft OneDrive. And they're using these cloud data synchronization platforms to suck up all of that data up into the cloud for them to take a copy of and then extort the victim. So after stealing data, it's time to deploy ransomware. Sodinokibi is detected by a lot of antivirus vendors. Most antivirus software will pick up Sodinokibi. So instead of changing their malware, what the attackers are doing are using their admin privileges, their presence within the environment, to disable antivirus across the entire estate. They're logging into the consoles of antivirus software to disable antivirus across the entire environment. If they're not able to access the corporate console or the cloud console to disable AV across the estate, then they're deploying scripts from GitHub to every Windows machine in the estate to disable to disable the antivirus. Here we see a script pulled from GitHub where the attacker is disabling the Asset antivirus tool. After disabling antivirus, most of the REvil attackers will delete backups, file backups, archives, and virtual machine snapshots to prevent recovery. This is all about securing more payout for the ransomware attackers. When it's time to deploy ransomware, we're seeing most of the REvil attackers use the tried and true method of creating an open SMB share to host the malware, and then pushing out scheduled tasks using group policy to download and execute that ransomware. So as systems update their group policy, they pull down their scheduled task, they create a scheduled task, and they download and execute the ransomware, and then encryption begins. Most affiliates are also using PSExec and other remote execution tools like SMBExec to mop up any systems that were missed, so systems that didn't download and execute the Sodinokibi ransomware. The end product is most systems within the entire environment are ransomed. Here is a ransom message showing what that looks like. And every ransom message also includes this nice infographic that includes contact information and points victims towards the Onion site to begin negotiations to the ransomware platform. So REvil are pretty interesting because they have that platform, because they're very effective. But essentially what we're talking about here is an attack lifecycle that looks like any other attack lifecycle. You have the attacker stepping through the stages of compromise, gaining privilege, scanning the environment, moving laterally within the environment. The only difference between REvil and an APT crew is at the end, you get a ransom event. You get data theft followed by a ransom. So at each point of this life cycle is an opportunity for us to detect them as defenders, and that's really what we're trying to get across. That the tradecraft that they're using at the moment is highly detectable, highly signaturable, and we shouldn't see them being as successful as they are. So that's a little bit about REvil and their ransomware as a service platform. I'll now hand over to Tom, who will cover CACbot and Doppelpaymer, which uses a different model for ransom and intrusion.
Thanks, Mitch. So the second set of activity we're going to look is a set of campaigns where organisations being affected by CACbot. And that access is then sold on to a secondary group who are encrypting the environment with Doppelpaymer ransomware. Historically, CACbot itself is more of a banking Trojan. It's modular by design, which we'll cover later. It really lends itself to this kind of partnership. What we're seeing though in 2020 is these organisations who have been infected with CACbot being infected across pretty much a wide range of their environment, where that access is then sold on to a developer who's deploying Doppelpaymer, encrypting the environment and then placing a ransom demand to them. Slightly different from what we've seen with REvil though, where in this model, the CACbot operators are selling on access. It's then on to the ransomware developer to encrypt the environment and to deal with any ransom negotiations. There's no platform or as a service model here. So talking through kind of a typical life cycle, I've put a line here on the right so you can see. On the left-hand side, these are all the responsibilities for the catwalk operator. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have the ransomware developer. What we're seeing typically is initial intrusion by phishing emails, pretty targeted for the specific users. This then will infect the system with catwalk. Fairly quickly after that, we'll see Cobalt Strike drops. They'll then do some form of reconnaissance across the environment. They'll bring in tools like bloodhounds to enumerate kind of domain structures. They'll use kind of living off the land binaries to understand where they are and to ping to other systems. And we'll then see some form of lateral movement. Typically, this is a combination of PSExec or remote desktop, kind of using credentials they've taken from the environment. And I'll take these credentials using things like procdump, so another sysinternals tool, to get a copy of LSAS memory, and then use Mimikatz to extract any credentials in clear text. The ultimate aim, though, is to effectively push out CACBot as widely across the environment as possible, followed by Cobalt Strike as a secondary persistence mechanism. They're fairly noisy in this, but successful in that not all systems across the environment may be fully patched with antivirus, or may not be working in some cases. This gives them a foothold across many systems. What we're seeing, though, in 2020 across Europe is in a pause. So it could be a few weeks, a few months. But we're then seeing a second stage of activity where access is being sold on, and coming in through one of these catbot connections, we see ransomware developers executing their doppelganger binaries in this instance. And this is then followed by ransomware demand. So to give you a view of what this looks like, the initial compromise, as I said, typically is a targeted phishing campaign. They're fairly unsophisticated, as you can see here. It's purely a hyperlink. The user would click this. They're then fetching a remote resource, in this case a zip file. The zip file contains a Visual Basic script, which is effectively a second stage loader. Upon execution, it takes a catbot binary from a remote resource, executes this, giving the operator persistence to that system. This then is running at system level, so they have the highest level of privileges they can for that endpoint. So, catbot, as I said, it's modular by design. This means that selectively you can choose which modules to load based on what you're trying to achieve. But the default configuration gives you a C2 channel where you can upload, download, and execute files on that system. And Rich could talk you through a few of the modules that we see being used commonly. So, primarily in these campaigns, the data theft side of the ransom typically comes via email. We're not seeing too much interaction with file-based taking of files, but there's a module that catbot gives you which really helps the attacker's serve this purpose. So in this case, what is it doing? Well, it's initializing a MAPI connection to the local Outlook client. This is really useful because it allows the attacker to take a copy of all the emails locally on Outlook, and it places them in the user profile as MSG files. As a defender, this is quite helpful for us because we now have a log of what's being staged in that system. Once this is complete, the data is then compressed and sent upstream to the C2 channel. And if you, in your organization, don't have any form of kind of network-based monitoring, have no validation that data is actually gone other than the staging of the system itself. As I said, like many other operators, both nation state, red team, financially motivated groups, we're seeing a lot of use of Cobalt Strike. It's really successful, it's really simple, and there's two ways you can load this with catbot. We can see arbitrary kind of file downloads, so you can take your Cobalt Strike, you can pull it to the system, execute it. But the challenge here is antivirus can catch this. So there's a module where catbot can then load the module, and you can then execute Cobalt Strike running in memory to give you a secondary persistence mechanism to a different C2 channel. This means that if the organization notices catbot on one of their systems, they find the C2 channel it's working on and block it on the proxies or firewalls, you've got a secondary method back into the environment. And then finally, we see a web inject module. This is kind of a remnant, really, from the banking Trojan days of catbot. There's two purposes for this. Obviously, financially motivated still. If you as a user are browsing to a site and you have your credentials captured, they can use that for the financial purposes. But also people reuse credentials, right? So if the user is using the same password for their banking site as they are for their logons in the environment, that's useful information for an attacker. It's fairly simple. The module effectively injects into explorer.exe. It iterates through pre-configured sites, mainly noting that even in the European breaches, we are seeing primarily North American organizations within these lists. And then it injects JavaScript elements to those sites. So when the user is entering the username and password, it is then captured by the module and sent back upstream. So that's catwalk. Let's talk about doppelpayment. Doppelpayment is interesting for us. There's a few different delivery mechanisms. Typically what happens on the handover process is they're given access to a system running catwalk. They'll move pretty quickly to a domain controller, which is a popular kind of method of choice for most ransomware operators. And they'll set up group policies. Firstly, they'll push out a script to disable antivirus on the endpoints. Unlike Revil, they won't really be interacting with the antivirus server itself. And once this is done, they'll then iterate through a list of computers of their target choices. And they'll push it out again via scripts with group policy with 3 methods. We see sysinternals used for psexec, takes a binary, moves it across, executes it. We see bits jobs, so built-in Windows-based functionality, slightly less quiet than psexec. And finally, we see scheduled tasks, which is pretty common across most groups. A bit noisy, but really successful. So now we've got double payment on an endpoint. There's 4 stages to encryption. Firstly, double payment will enumerate all of the local users on the system. There's a pre-configured string within the variant, you can see here in green. And it concatenates this with an MD5 hash of a computer name. And it will then reset all of the passwords for all the local accounts with this password. The idea being here that they want to lock you out from the system. Stage 2, it sets itself up to service. So identify a core Windows service running on System32 and make a copy of this. It'll append it with -1, both the service name and the binary. And it'll then take the doppelpayment binary, which they've copied across with the script, and they'll overwrite the legitimate binary for that original service. This is important for the next stage, bearing in mind it's a legitimate Windows service that's running. Because stage 3, we start to see configuration changes to the boot database. Now, firstly, they disable startup repair. This is a common tactic you'll see used to recover an operating system. They'll remove that option from the system. And they'll make changes so that under safe boots, the core services are set to run. Now, as you remember from the last stage, we now have doppelpayment running as a core service. This means that if you as a user go into safe mode, you're still running the binary and the actions are still going on in the background. And then the final part of this stage is they'll make a change to group policy so that if you try to log on to the system, you get a splash screen saying the system's being encrypted. The final stage, and kind of really where it's most important, because this is where you can stop encryption happening, is where it reboots the system. So if you can catch a system before it reboots, you can typically recover. However, upon starting reboots, all of your files are then encrypted. It will overwrite the extension to the .doppelt to indicate that file's been encrypted. And there'll be a corresponding file with the same file name, the extension howtodecrypt.txt, which will contain the decryption details. At this point, all of your files, once it's gone through this iterative process, will be encrypted. And the only way to recover is restoring from backup or dealing with the operator. So takeaways. Well, it's a highly effective campaign. Catbot's been around for a while now. They're very good at what they do. So as a partner, it makes sense for the ransomware developer. It's very high impact. Unlike Revil, where you can still access the systems, but the files are encrypted, doppelpayment removes that avenue from you. The idea being that it's high impact and you're pressurized into dealing with them and paying the ransom demand. And they're very highly active. Because Catbot's so effective, there's so many organizations compromised. We're seeing over periods of 2020 as many as one organization a day being compromised by doppelpayment. And we expect to see this carry on growing. So now Mitch is going to wrap up our talk, go through the conclusions on what we think is going to happen moving forward in this environment and ransom operations as they move forward.
Thank you, Tom. So we've looked at Revil, we've looked at doppelpayment, two different ransomware operators, but generally indicative of the wider ransomware industry and how it's developed in 2020. So going into 2021 and going forward, unfortunately, it's probably a continuing problem. And this year, it's the biggest it's ever been in terms of damage and impact to organizations and industry, and that trend is only upwards. So we're probably going to see payouts increasing, both in size and the number of organizations paying out as ransomware deployments get more effective and it gets more and more difficult to recover without paying. We'll see the number of victims increase as ransomware operators continue to scale up and recruit more people, as well as improve their platforms and create some automation and efficiencies to improve their business. So, we're using language that we use to talk about how a startup scales up in the early phases of business development. And we'll see that with ransomware operators. We'll see the damage to organizations increase as ransomware attackers get better at deploying their software, deploying their malware across an entire organization. They'll get better at deleting backups and getting that ransomware out there, which will increase the damage to organizations. Potentially, we'll get to a point where the only way to recover is either to pay the ransom or to have good backups and recovery mechanisms in place, which might be a little bit rare at the moment. We'll also see the extortion of stolen data increase in terms of the effectiveness of that technique. So a lot of ransomware attackers at the moment are opportunistically stealing data. During a breach, they'll identify data of interest and take it out of the environment. But sometimes that data isn't that impactful. There's no breach of regulations, there's no personal information in the data stolen. You don't want it out there in the general public, but in terms of damage to the business or damage to reputation, maybe it's not so impactful. So potentially we'll see attackers get better at choosing which data they choose to take, which data they choose to steal, which will increase the pressure on victims to pay, which means more profit. So with all of these factors, profits are only going to increase. With so many victims, so much compromise going on for ransomware, unfortunately, the only trend is upwards. Without much downwards pressure from law enforcement agencies, we just don't see ransomware stopping anytime soon. So 2021 will likely be bigger than 2020. On the flip side, and in a positive note, ransomware is now a boardroom risk. In a lot of corporate risk registers, cyber risk registers, ransomware is now the number one threat to business because it's impactful and it's potentially business stopping. So the upshot here is either more investment in cybersecurity or realistically better targeted spends of corporate cybersecurity budgets. Technically, I think we'll see improvements to tradecraft. We see probably more stealth happening, being included into the tactics, techniques, and tradecraft of ransomware attackers. At the moment, they're very, very fast, but they're very, very loud. And at each point of that attack lifecycle, they're extremely detectable. So as we, as a defensive industry, get better at improving our network security hygiene, potentially we'll see attackers have to shift their tradecraft to adapt to that. And with that comes tooling improvements, less reliance on open source or freemium or corporate penetration testing tools and research software, and more bespoke malware or bespoke tools that attackers are creating themselves. We'll see faster transition to domain admin. They're already fast, but they're quite noisy and they do make a few mistakes, but they get there. So we'll see them increase their speed, which means time between initial access and ransomware deployment will continue to decrease. We'll see increased ransomware deployment methods. Group policy objects are not the best way to get ransom out across to a victim organization, so we'll likely see the attackers shift to using tools like SCCM or other corporate software deployment solutions that are more effective at getting that widespread faster. And of course, we'll see increased effectiveness to delete backups. We'll see more time, potentially, or more effectiveness in deleting those backups to prevent recovery. So lastly, what's next? We'll see continued focus on mass exploitation of edge devices. A lot of security research is going into edge devices at the moment. We've seen this in the past, and it seems to have made a comeback in terms of research focus. So we're probably going to see more of these high-impact edge vulnerabilities in 2021. So we'll see the attackers likely exploiting this quicker and more effectively. Attackers have some limiting factors. There are too many victims. They're getting access to too many organizations, and they don't have enough people, enough operators to properly leverage these accesses into payouts. So as they recruit, as they improve their platforms, as they automate, they'll be able to hit more victims in a shorter amount of time with less resources, more efficient use of resources. So in these cases, we'll see the attackers ramp up their capability into 2021. Similarly, at the moment, there's not a lot of down pressure on ransomware attackers from law enforcement. They operate in jurisdictions where there's essentially no pressure on them to stop their operations. They're very successful. So, the best we can do as defenders is make sure to improve our network security hygiene. The basics would stop a lot of these ransomware attackers from being successful at the moment. So unfortunately, without that law enforcement downwards pressure, that's the best we can do. And that current law enforcement pressure from those jurisdictions is probably not enough to decrease the cost-benefit analysis for the ransomware attackers. So that's the conclusion of our presentation. Thank you very much for listening to our talk about REvil and Doppelpaymer. I believe we have a live question and answer session, so we'll now go to that. Thank you.